At 53, I thought my life was finally settled, until my father-in-law called me a beggar and set off a war he never saw coming. One thing I can't stand: a king who steals from his own soldiers. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. The insult that finally broke 25 years of my patience was delivered over chilled shrimp cocktail. It was Memorial Day. The humid air of a Boston summer hung heavy over Richard Davenport's estate, a sprawling Tudor manor in Wellesley that smelled faintly of old money and fresh-cut grass. He was 74, a living relic of a bygone era. He reigned over his social circle like a fading monarch, with his perfectly tailored blazer and his booming laugh. My wife Catherine, his daughter, moved among the guests with a practiced grace, her smile a little too tight at the corners, her eyes constantly on her father, seeking his approval like a compass seeking true north. A guest, a retired judge from a prominent Boston family, had cornered me near the rose garden. "Tell me, Michael, I hear you were quite the wizard in the tech world. What was your company called again?" Before I could answer, Richard appeared as if from thin air, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He draped a heavy, familiar arm over my shoulder, his touch as condescending as his words. Michael was a prodigy with his little computer programs, he said, his voice a low rumble that carried perfectly over the polite hum of conversation. He made a splash, yes, but new money is a fleeting thing. It's legacy blood that endures. I felt my jaw clench. The judge, an old friend of Richard's, nodded knowingly. I felt a prickle of heat on my neck. A familiar burn. It was the same old song and dance he had been performing for over 2 decades. The tech founder, the self-made man, was just a temporary guest in his world. I was nothing but the boy who had stolen his precious daughter away from a world he had crafted for her. He never missed an opportunity. At my daughter's high school graduation, he toasted Catherine for raising such a fine young woman, despite her husband's humble beginnings. At our 25th anniversary, he had raised a glass and said, "To Catherine for finding happiness despite her father's doubts." He had made a lifetime of small cuts, all designed to remind me that no matter what I achieved, I would never be one of them. My money had paid for their country club memberships, their vacations, and even a new wing on their summer house, but it would never buy me a place at their table. Richard raised his glass and his voice boomed a little louder. "To those of us who build institutions," he declared, his eyes sweeping across his guests, "and to those who are fortunate enough to be invited to the table." He looked directly at me. The judge and a small circle of guests turned their attention to us. Richard's eyes, a piercing blue, held mine for a moment. He lowered his voice, but not enough to be private. "After all," he added, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips, "even a beggar deserves a good meal every now and then." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was unanimous. The clinking glasses seemed to mock me. My wife, Catherine, shot me a look, not of support, not of outrage on my behalf. It was a silent, desperate plea, a warning: don't you dare ruin this party. In that moment, her silent betrayal fused with the sound of the clinking glasses and the faint patrician smirks on the faces of Richard's friends. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. For 25 years since I had first met his daughter, I had let him talk. I had laughed it off. I had been the bigger man. I had done it for Catherine. Now he was calling me a beggar. I thought of the quiet, patient way I had worked for decades, not for attention but for the satisfaction of building something from nothing. While Richard was busy preening at his club, my team and I were pulling all-nighters, writing code that would one day power a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. I had retired at 40, sold my company, and had since spent my time in a quiet, low-profile life. But every single one of my accomplishments, my entire professional life, was rendered worthless by him, and my wife let him. The night air had a familiar chill, not from the weather, but from the cold fury that now held me in its grip. The shrimp cocktail didn't taste so good anymore. I looked at the Tudor manor. I looked at my wife still smiling for her father's friends. I thought of my retirement. I thought of all the money I had. I was no beggar. I was a man who had built a fortune from the ground up with his own hands and his own mind. I excused myself from the table, my good humor an iron mask. Richard, of course, paid no attention. He was already regaling another guest with a story about a famous family ancestor who had endured the War of 1812. My mind, however, was already 100 miles away, running calculations. What if? What if I could show him? What if I could show him what a true legacy looks like? This wasn't about a comeback. This wasn't about a personal grudge. This was about justice. The kind of justice that a man like Richard Davenport would never see coming. I walked to my car, leaving the party early. I knew what I had to do. The silence in the car was a welcome relief. It was a blank page. The war had just begun. The rage finally broke free in the car on the way home. A silent, seething fury that had been building for 25 years. It wasn't the insult itself that stung. It was the casual, effortless way Richard had delivered it, and the effortless way Catherine had ignored it. Once we were inside our home, the simmering anger boiled over. He called me a beggar, Catherine, to his friends, and you just stood there like a statue while they all laughed at me. She flinched, not from my words, but from the volume of them. She didn't raise her voice, but her tone was a shield, the same one Sif always used to deflect the truth. That's just how he is, Michael. You know that. He's an old man. You have to be bigger. Bigger? I echoed, my voice tight with disbelief. Bigger than what? Bigger than a man who spent 25 years belittling me? I was bigger when he told our daughter I wasn't a real father because I hadn't inherited a name. I was bigger when he took credit for the scholarship fund I secretly set up in his father's name. I was bigger when he introduced me as Catherine's husband to every single person he thought mattered. When does being bigger just mean being a doormat, Catherine? She turned away, going to the guest room. You such are making a scene, Michael. You such are being ridiculous. You're just embarrassed. She didn't get it. She never had. She had lived her entire life bathed in the false glow of the Davenport name. Her identity was so tied to his approval that she could not see his malice. She could only see my failure to conform to it. Her silence in the face of his cruelty was a deeper betrayal than any word he could have spoken. After she went to sleep, the house fell into a profound silence. I went to my office, the one space in our home that was truly my own. For years I had quietly managed the fortune I earned from my company, a sum so vast I never told Catherine or her family. It was my secret legacy, the quiet counterpoint to their public one. I had always known that money, the very thing they pretended to have in abundance, would be the poison that would turn them against me. I had kept my wealth a secret for so long out of a foolish hope that their love was unconditional. The desk felt cold under my hands. The old desktop monitor glowed to life, illuminating the dark room. I logged into my private financial terminal. The numbers on the screen glowed back at me, a silent testament to a life of hard work, discipline, and success. I watched the live feed of the market. The sum was dizzying. $124,719,304. It was a number that represented every late night, every risky decision, every ounce of sweat equity I had put into my life's work. It was my truth. I looked from the screen to a photo of Richard on the mantelpiece, taken at a company gala. He was standing there with that familiar smirk, a king at a feast of his own making. He saw me as nothing, a temporary guest in his world of permanent prestige. He had no idea I had the power to buy his entire world, his house, his company, his reputation, his very name. I could buy them all. My fingers, almost of their own volition, moved to open a new browser window. I navigated to a business acquisition site, then to the public records page. I typed in Davenport and Sons. The company's financials, a sad, slow decline for a decade, were all there. The valuation was a joke, a fraction of its former self. I had watched it happen over the years, a slow-motion car crash of incompetence and arrogance. Richard, refusing to modernize, refusing to change, was steering his father's company directly into the ground. I scrolled through years of data, through a litany of failed product lines, wasted advertising budgets, and bloated executive salaries. I thought about his little speech. To those of us who build institutions, he didn't build an institution. He was slowly, methodically dismantling one. But as I scrolled, I noticed something odd, something that didn't add up. A sudden, unexplained jump in revenue a few years back. A brief spike that was impossible for the company's trajectory. It was a single, impossible needle in a haystack of mediocrity, and it made me pause. It didn't look like an accident. It didn't look like incompetence. It looked like a cover-up. The decision was made not with the fiery heat of anger, but with the quiet, cold certainty of an executioner. This wasn't about hurting him back. It wasn't about revenge in the petty sense of the word. It was about showing him what it meant to have true wealth, true power. It was about proving to him that legacy wasn't just in a name, it was in the hands of the person who built it. I had to show him that I was more than a beggar, and that he was less than a king. I picked up my phone and called my wealth manager, David. The clock on my screen read 3:47 a.m. The conversation was going to be short, and to the point. This is a moral crusade, not an acquisition. My wealth manager, David, said on our first call, his voice a calm counterpoint to the fury that had been simmering inside me for days. It was a Monday morning, less than 48 hours after the Memorial Day party, and the city of Boston was already buzzing with the usual work week rhythm. David, a man who saw the world in spreadsheets and risk assessments, understood immediately that this was different. I wasn't just buying a company, I was buying justice. We had a second, more detailed conversation later that day over an encrypted signal chat, which we had named the Legacy Project. I liked the name, it was fitting. It was my legacy of integrity versus his legacy of lies. David had already moved with a swiftness and efficiency that was both reassuring and terrifying. Within 24 hours, our shell corporation was formed, Stone Harbor Investments. The name was deliberately generic, designed to be as unremarkable as a gray rock on a shoreline. It would be my ghost in the machine, my unseen hand pulling the levers. David's team of forensic accountants, the best in the business, slipped into the digital guts of Davenport and Sons, under the guise of a standard due diligence audit. I gave them one directive, a simple one-line instruction that would set everything in motion. His lavish lifestyle doesn't match the company's bottom line. Find out where the money's coming from. It's not just bad management, it's something darker. Richard, of course, was furious. He complained bitterly to Catherine about the vultures trying to buy his company, about the indignity of having these accountants rummaging through his legacy. Catherine, in her usual willful blindness, would relay his frustration to me. "He's so stressed, Michael," she'd say. "He says they're looking into everything, it's just so unfair." I would just nod, a silent observer in a play she didn't realize I was directing. I let him rage. Every complaint was a tiny victory, a confirmation that my ghost was getting closer to the truth. The initial reports from David's team were grim but predictable. They confirmed what I had long suspected. The company was a bloated relic of the last century, weighed down by vanity projects, terrible investments, and a stubborn refusal to modernize. The audit trail was a mess of haphazardly filed reports and outdated software. Richard's incompetence was so profound that it was almost impressive. But then David's top analyst, a sharp young woman named Lena, flagged something deeper, something that didn't make sense. Her email to me was short, with a single troubling attachment. It showed a series of unusual transactions. "The pension fund is a mess," David reported to me over our secure call. "The numbers are fuzzy, deliberately obtuse. There are huge withdrawals categorized as administrative fees, but there's no corresponding paperwork. It doesn't look like incompetence, Michael. It looks like a cover-up." That's when a new kind of cold certainty settled over me. This wasn't just about a man's arrogance. This wasn't just about his ego. He was not just a failing businessman. He was a thief. The hunt was on. While Richard was busy railing against the vultures, my ghosts, my team of digital specters, were quietly pulling on a thread that would unravel his entire life. The trail of breadcrumbs was digital, and it was leading them right to the heart of his greatest secret. The closer they got, the quieter he became, and the more worried Catherine looked. The silence in their house was no longer a sign of peace, but of a gathering storm. The deeper my ghosts dug, the fouler the scent became. The initial findings had been an intellectual exercise, a predictable audit of a failing company. But as the days turned into weeks, the numbers stopped telling a story of incompetence and started telling a story of something far more malicious. David and his team discovered that for years massive withdrawals had been made from the employee pension fund. On the official balance sheets, they were categorized under the innocuous heading of administrative fees. But when my team demanded the corresponding paperwork, there was none. The money was simply vanishing, like water disappearing into sand. It's a deliberate smokescreen, Michael. David told me over a secure call on our Signal chat, his voice low and tight. There's no paper trail, no invoices, no service agreements. Someone was just taking the money and calling it a fee. The first few transactions were small, almost negligible, but they grew over time, in both size and frequency. My team worked backward, cross-referencing years of data, from quarterly reports to digitized bank statements. The pattern was unmistakable and sickening. The more Richard's business failed, the more money he siphoned from the fund. While my team was quietly pulling on this thread, Catherine's anxiety was growing, fraying her perfect composure. She was like a barometer for Richard's stress. One evening, as we sat in the kitchen in late July, she put down her teacup with a clatter. "Dad seems so stressed," she said, her hands trembling slightly. "He says they're asking too many personal questions now. It's not just about the business, he says. It's about his finances." I had to feign sympathy. My stomach churned with the knowledge that the man she worshipped, the man she so desperately wanted me to emulate, was not just a snob, but a common thief. "I'm sure it's just the stress of a major transaction, honey," I said, a lie so practiced it tasted like truth. "He'll adjust. They're just doing their jobs." "But he's so worried about the pension fund," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "He says the new owners are digging into it, asking all sorts of questions. Why would they do that, Michael? He says it SEP's all just routine expenses." I just shrugged, the picture of detached concern. "It's standard due diligence, Kath. They have to make sure the books are clean." But the truth was her father's facade was cracking, and she was watching the pieces fall away in real time. The breaking point came a week later. On a Tuesday morning, David sent me a single damning email, a receipt for a wire transfer. His team had traced the flow of the fees. The money was being wired from the Davenport Employee Pension Trust to an offshore shell company, an LLC named RDV Holdings in the Cayman Islands. I stared at the name on the screen. Red DV Richard Davenport Vance. He wasn't just stealing from the company. He was stealing from his employees' retirement fund and laundering it through a secret account. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The beggar insult was a slight to my ego, a cruel joke. This was a violation of dozens of lives, of the very workers who built his legacy. This was a crime. My mission was no longer about personal revenge. It was about retribution. The scent of a deeper crime had led me to a truth far uglier than I ever imagined. The hunt was over, and the prey was in my sights. Now it was time to close the trap. The deal was set to close in early August, and I knew what I would find when I was finally given the keys to his kingdom. The day I bought Davenport and Sons, Richard had no idea he was handing the keys to his kingdom to the man he despised. The irony was so perfect it felt like a dream. The closing was held in his elegant, oak-paneled office in downtown Boston in early August. He sat at the head of a mahogany table, a regal, performative frown etched on his face. He signed the papers with a flourish of disgusted grandeur, as if he were signing over a toxic asset rather than the last bastion of his family's pride. "I hope you're happy," he said, pushing the signed document across the table toward David, who was acting as our official representative. "You've acquired a mess. A beautiful mess, mind you, but a mess all the same." His only condition was that he remain on as chairman, a powerless figurehead. I wasn't there in person, but David's face on our secure video call was a mask of professional politeness. He agreed immediately. I knew Richard saw this as a small, hollow victory, a way to save face. He didn't know he had just signed over the legal rights to every last one of his secrets to me. After the closing, our team of forensic accountants, led by David and Lena, moved in with the quiet efficiency of a surgical strike. We had full access. No more fighting for documents. No more running from vague excuses. They swarmed the company's financial records, cross-referencing everything they had found in their preliminary audit with the real, unredacted documents. On the third day of our deep dive, David called me. "We have a confession, Michael. A junior accountant named Ben. He's been here 5 years. He's terrified." I had to hear it for myself. I got on the line listening as David put him on speakerphone. Ben's voice was shaky, a terrified whisper. He told us a story of coercion and fear. For 5 years, Richard had systematically used him to cook the books, manipulating the company's financial records to hide the most heinous crime. Ben described how he was instructed to move money from the employee pension fund, not once, but dozens of times to cover Richard's own lavish expenses. The wire transfers were disguised as administrative fees and sent to his offshore accounts, exactly as my team had previously discovered. Ben broke down crying as he listed some of the expenditures Richard had paid for with the stolen money. The total he had stolen from his own employees was $4.8 million. The number hit me hard. My stomach turned, not with the anger of a wounded ego, but with a profound and righteous disgust. The beggar insult was a slight to my pride, a cruel joke that I could easily have forgotten. This, however, was different. This was a violation of dozens of lives, of the very workers who had spent their entire lives building his family's legacy. This was a man who had not just failed his company, but had plundered it, stealing from his most vulnerable employees to protect the illusion of his wealth. My mission was no longer about personal revenge. The idea of getting back at him for a snide comment now seemed petty and small. This was about retribution. The king had stolen from his own soldiers. Now he would pay the ultimate price. I had the wire transfer confirmations, the company records, and now the terrified testimony of a witness. I had all the evidence I needed to expose him for the common thief he was. The trap was set. Now I just had to let him walk into it. The final act was waiting. For 1 week, I let Richard play king. I watched from a distance as he strutted through the halls of Davenport and Sons, a tragic figure declaiming his own greatness. He had no idea that he was already a ghost, haunting a company that was no longer his. He saw the new management, my ghosts, as nothing more than temporary intruders, a minor inconvenience before his inevitable return to power. He held impromptu meetings, puffed out his chest, and lectured employees on the importance of the family name. It was his final pathetic performance, and I gave him the stage. He was oblivious, so consumed by his own wounded pride, he couldn't see the pieces of the trap I was laying right in front of him. He called a board meeting for the last Wednesday of August, intending to deliver a blistering, triumphant speech against the new owners and their vulgar business practices. He wanted to cement his legacy not just as a successful chairman, but as the noble victim of a hostile takeover. He sent the agenda for the meeting to David, who of course was listed as my representative on the board. The agenda was a masterpiece of self-aggrandizing fiction, with bullet points like review of corporate legacy and future vision, and chairman's recommendations for a path forward. He saw it as a grand finale, his last chance to command a room full of people who for decades had bowed to his will. David forwarded the agenda to me with a one-word message: showtime. The night before the meeting, the house was silent and heavy. Catherine hadn't spoken to me in days, a quiet protest against my perceived indifference to her father's suffering, but she came to me in my study, a rare act of vulnerability that showed how desperate she was. "Can't you do something, Michael?" she pleaded, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Please, it's not just a company to him. It's his entire identity, our family's entire life. What happens to the Davenport name if it's all just torn down?" I looked at her, the woman I had loved for 30 years, the woman who had stood beside me through the lean years, the boom years, and the quiet years. But she was not standing beside me now. She was standing with him, with the fantasy of her family name. Her loyalty wasn't to me or to the truth. It was to an illusion she had built her life upon. "Some things, Catherine," I said, my voice quiet, "have to be torn down before they can be rebuilt, and some things are so rotten, you have to burn them down completely." She shook her head, not understanding. She couldn't see what was so obvious to me, that Richard's company His entire life's work was a rotten edifice built on a stolen foundation. She couldn't see that by saving him she was enabling a crime. She didn't understand. She would in the morning. I walked her to the bedroom door, then went back to my study. I looked at the briefcase on my desk. Inside, David had placed a single folder. It contained everything: the wire transfer records to RDV Holdings, the auditor's report, and the junior accountant's affidavit. I didn't need to look at it. I already knew every line by heart. I didn't just have a legal case, I had a moral one. I had the truth. Tomorrow Richard was going to step onto the stage for his final performance, but he was going to find out that the play he thought he was in was an entirely different genre. It was a tragedy, and he was the star. Richard entered his boardroom like a star taking the stage, a half-cocked smile on his face, expecting to command the room. The last Wednesday of August was crisp and clear, a perfect day for a man to deliver his final blistering speech. The board members were all seated, their faces a mix of deference and anticipation. He strode toward the head of the table, his chair the one he had sat in for 25 years. He saw me then. I was sitting in his chair. My hands were folded on the mahogany table. I hadn't moved a muscle. My calm presence was the first crack in his confident facade. The half-smile on his face vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. He froze, his entire body going rigid. The room, which had been buzzing with quiet conversation, fell into an absolute, breathless silence. "Michael," he said, his voice a low, guttural sputter, "what is the meaning of this?" I didn't stand up. "It means the beggar is now sitting at the head of the table, Richard," I said, my voice quiet, but it seemed to fill the room. The board members, who had been looking at him, turned to look at me, then back at him, stunned. He began to sputter, his face turning a furious shade of red. "This is an outrage, a complete lack of respect. This is my office, my company. I will not stand for this indignity." He ranted about tradition, about legacy, about the vulgarity of new money. He waved his hands, gesturing wildly toward the framed pictures on the walls, portraits of his father and grandfather, men who had built something real. I let him go on for a moment, letting him fill the silence with his own hot air. It was the last time he would ever be able to do that. When he finally paused to take a breath, his chest heaving, I cut him off. My voice, by contrast, was calm and precise, like a scalpel. "Let's talk about tradition," I said. My eyes locked on his. "And let's talk about legacy." I glanced at David, who was sitting to my right, a briefcase on his lap. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Let's talk about the Davenport Employee Pension Fund," I continued, my voice carrying in the silent room. "The one that was started by your grandfather in 1948 to provide for his loyal workers." Richard's face, already red, turned a pasty white. He knew. In that moment, he finally truly understood. All the smugness, all the arrogance, all the false pride drained out of him, leaving him hollowed out and terrified. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his eyes darting from me to the board members. "I think you do," I said. I nodded to David, who stood up and walked to the center of the table. He didn't speak a word. He just placed a single, damning folder in front of every board member. The folder was thin, but what was inside was heavier than any of us. I picked up my own copy. "You see, Richard, my team and I had a hunch. Your lifestyle didn't match your company's SIPET's bottom line, and a closer look at the books revealed that the pension fund, the very fund your grandfather started, was hemorrhaging money under the guise of administrative fees." I stood up slowly, the power in my voice growing with every word. I walked around the table, the board members now staring intently at the documents in front of them, their faces grim. Richard watched me, a helpless animal caught in a trap. "But you didn't know," I said, my eyes locked on his, "that I have the wire transfer records of the $4.8 million you stole from your employees, the people who gave you their entire lives, the people who trusted your name, your legacy, the people who worked on the factory floor, not in your lavish office." I placed a single document in front of him. It was a copy of a wire transfer confirmation from the Davenport Employee Pension Trust to RDV Holdings, LLC, with the offshore address printed clearly. his secret in black and white for all to see. You didn't just fail this company, I said, my voice like cold steel. You plundered it. You're not a king, Richard. You're a common thief. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. He was a statue, frozen in a moment of utter disgrace. You're fired, I said, my final word on the matter. I looked at the board members, all of whom had now seen the truth with their own eyes. And I'm recommending the board file a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office this afternoon. Richard Davenport, the king of his castle, the man who had called me a beggar, crumpled. His legacy, the very thing he thought would endure forever, was over. He had no one to blame but himself. He thought he was a player in a game of power. He didn't know he was nothing more than a criminal in a courtroom. The beggar had won, and the war had just begun. The fallout was absolute overnight. Richard went from being a respected chairman to a disgraced pariah. The news spread like wildfire through the Boston business community and social circles. The story of a well-known patriarch, a man who had preached integrity and family legacy his entire life, being exposed as a common thief stealing from his own employees' pension fund, was too juicy for anyone to ignore. The name Davenport became synonymous with disgrace, a stain that would never wash out. But the true collapse was personal. It happened in the quiet of our home. A few hours after I got back from the office, Catherine was waiting for me in the living room. Her face wasn't filled with rage, but with a cold, disbelieving horror. She was clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles were white, as if the device could somehow be a lifeline to a reality that no longer existed. "Tell me this isn't true, Michael," she said, her voice a thin, shaky whisper. "Tell me this is just some sick revenge plot." I had expected this, but the sheer fragility of her denial still shocked me. I walked over to the coffee table and placed a single document in front of her. It was a copy of one of the wire transfer confirmations David had given me. "Look at this, Catherine," I said calmly. "That is a wire transfer from a factory workers' pension fund." My finger tapped on the document. "Look at the amount. Look at the date. Look where it went, to an offshore account your father used to pay for his bespoke tailored suits. The very suits he wore when he called me a beggar." I waited for a flicker of horror. I waited for her to see the truth. I waited for her to understand that this was not about me or him, but about right and wrong. I waited for her to be appalled that the man she worshipped had stolen from people who had nothing. She looked at the document, then at me, her eyes filling with a heartbreaking sadness. She didn't see the theft or the victim. She only saw the name on the account. She only saw her father. She let out a small, quiet sob and put her hands to her face. "He was under a lot of pressure," she whispered, the words sounding more like a plea than an excuse. It was a lie and she knew it, but it was a lie she had to believe to protect the fantasy she had built her life upon. That was the moment I knew. Her loyalty wasn't to me, it wasn't to justice, it was to an illusion. And by showing her the truth, I had shattered it. The chasm between us was no longer a crack. It was a canyon, a silent, gaping void that I knew could never be bridged. She had chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. She packed a bag that night. I didn't try to stop her. She didn't say goodbye. She just walked out the front door, leaving the house silent, empty, and hollowed out. The war was over, but I was the only one left standing on the field. The price of justice was high, and I had just paid the most devastating installment. My first act as the sole owner of Davenport and Sons was to call an all-hands meeting. It was held in the company's main auditorium on a Friday morning. The room was tense and silent. Employees from the factory floor to the cubicles sat in rows, their faces a mix of worry and exhaustion. They had heard the whispers, seen the news reports. They knew something was terribly wrong. I stood on the stage, a single microphone in front of me, with no frills, no PowerPoint presentations, just the cold, hard truth. I told them everything. I explained that the Davenport family's management had not just been incompetent, but criminally negligent. I laid out the facts, explaining how the pension fund they had trusted was systematically plundered to fund a lifestyle of excess. I didn't try to sugarcoat it or use corporate speak. I just told them the truth, all of it. The betrayal I had felt was just an echo of the betrayal they had been living with for years. When I finished, the room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Then a man in the front row, an older gentleman with a tired face, asked the question everyone was thinking. What about us? What happens to our pensions? To our retirement? I had an answer ready. I have no intention of running this company under the Davenport name, I told them. I came here for one reason, and that was to correct a wrong. I looked at them all, at the worried faces of people who had given their lives to this company. My first promise to you is this. I will personally transfer $5 million of my own money into the pension fund. I had already made the wire transfer from my private account that morning. The money is already there. The pension fund is now whole, and then some. You have nothing to worry about. Your retirement is secure. A ripple went through the room. Some people started to cry. Others just sat, stunned, their shoulders visibly relaxing as the weight of their fear finally lifted. I watched a factory worker in the back row reach over and take his wife's hand. I saw a young father hug his son who was wearing a little Davenport baseball cap. In that moment, the numbers on my financial terminal didn't feel abstract anymore. This wasn't just a transaction, it was a rescue. It was my way of showing that true wealth was measured not in what you owned, but in who you protected. My second act was to sell the company. Over the next 2 weeks, David and I worked relentlessly to find a responsible buyer. I didn't want the highest bidder. I wanted a company that would guarantee their jobs and invest in their future. After a thorough search, we found one. We sold the company for a fraction of what I could have gotten on the open market, and I didn't take a dime of it for myself. Instead, I used the proceeds from the sale to establish a bonus fund. When the sale was finalized, every single employee, from the janitor to the junior accountant who had confessed to everything, received a check equivalent to 6 months of their salary. It was their money, returned with interest, a small apology for the years they had worked under a lie. I didn't want the Davenport name or its tarnished legacy. I just wanted to clean the slate. The money wasn't a show of force, it was a debt paid. Richard had defined his legacy by what he inherited, by what he took. I would define mine by what I gave back. That was 6 months ago. The war is over and the dust has settled. Richard is out on bail, a shrunken, broken man awaiting a trial he cannot win. His face, once full of a haughty arrogance, is now a mask of quiet shame. The last time I saw him was on the news, surrounded by reporters as he walked into the courthouse. The name that once commanded respect now only elicits a look of pity or disgust from those who see it. He lost his home, his reputation, and his freedom for the illusion of wealth he so desperately clung to. But the true price I paid was not for his downfall. It was for the quiet emptiness in my own life. My wife and I are separated. Catherine is living in New York with her sister, still clinging to a fantasy of her father's innocence. I walk through the rooms of this house we built together, and the silence is a physical weight. The sight of her old armchair by the window, a book still resting on the side table where she left it, is a constant, aching reminder of the life I chose to sacrifice for justice. I have the peace I never had before, but it's a hollow kind of victory, one that feels more like a cold consequence than a reward. But then I get letters. They come every few weeks from across the country. They're from the former Davenport and Sons employees. One is from the older man who asked me about his pension at the all-hands meeting. He sent me a picture of his grandkids, telling me they're saving for college now. He said his retirement is secure. Another is from the junior accountant, Ben, who confessed to everything. He wrote a note to tell me he was finally sleeping through the night. He called me a good man, something Richard would never have said. In those moments, I know I did the right thing. Richard's greatest mistake was in his definition of wealth. He thought it was a name, a house, a position at the table, a title that no one could take from him. He never understood that true legacy isn't what you inherit. It's the integrity you refuse to sacrifice, the debts you pay, and the people you protect. He thought I was a beggar, but he was the one who was truly poor. He was so starved for respect that he stole it from the very people who gave it to him. He called me a beggar, so I showed him what a rich man does. He pays the debts of the king, and sometimes he fires him too.